One of Mexico's wealthiest and most politically powerful families is so involved in drug trafficking and money laundering that the father and two sons, quote, pose a significant criminal threat to the United States, according to a recent report by the U.S. government's main drug intelligence task force. While U.S. law enforcement officials have spent years investigating the family, Carlos Hank Gonzalez and his sons Carlos Hank Ron and Jorge Hank Ron, the assessment by several agencies marks the first time that all three have been linked directly to the operations of major Mexican drug organizations. The Hank family, often described as Mexico's Rockefellers, is known for its multi-billion-dollar transportation, construction, and financial empire, and its great influence within the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, which has ruled Mexico for 7 decades. The report by the National Drug Intelligence Center drew on information from the DEA, the FBI, the U.S. Customs Service, CIA, Interpol, and others. The report says intelligence agencies had, quote, intercepted conversations of the Hank family coordinating drug shipments at TMM, a giant Hank-owned shipping company, and personally meeting with drug kingpins. The investigation of the Hank family, known in Mexico as Grupo Hank, was approved December 9, 1997, and concluded earlier this year. Quote, several years of investigative information strongly support the conclusion that the Hank family has laundered money on a massive scale, assisted drug trafficking organizations in transporting drug shipments, and engaged in large-scale public corruption. Further quote, Grupo Hank poses a significant criminal threat to the United States. Its multi-billion-dollar criminal and business empire, developed over several decades, reaches throughout Mexico and well into the United States. And that is from Douglas Farah at The Washington Post, from a story entitled Prominent Mexican Family Viewed as Threat to U.S. on Wednesday, June 2nd, 1999, almost 25 years ago. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
And welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa Ford. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I am joined by Joshua Treviño, the foundation's chief of intelligence and research. Josh, thank you for reading that passage. Can you start off by explaining why you chose it for today's episode, and can you also tell us how it ended?
Yeah, absolutely. I chose it because, we talk so often about corruption in Mexico, about this intersection between the state and the cartels and power holders. And we've also talked about this theme, which we come to over and over again, which is that nothing changes unless it's the actual power holders who are targeted from an investigatory standpoint, from a law enforcement standpoint, and so on. And Carlos Hank Gonzalez, the late Carlos Hank Gonzalez, is a great example of that intersection between the cartels and the power holders. By the 1990s, he was probably the most powerful man in Mexico. He absolutely controlled the PRI party, which is essentially the one that ran Mexico for 70 years, all the way up until the election of 2000 there. And he absolutely had no compunction about flaunting his power and his wealth. He was the guy with this amazing quote. I think we may have mentioned it on the show before, that a journalist asked him. He did this on the record, too. This is how unconcerned he was with accountability. A journalist asked him how it was that he was so wealthy if he was a public servant. And he said, do you remember this quote? A politician who is poor is a poor politician.
Yes, I remember. I think we have talked about that before.
Yeah, we definitely have. It's kind of the iconic Mexican corruption quote, and this idea that the only reason that you would get power is to plunder the citizenry that you rule over. And Carlos Hank Gonzalez was a great example of that. That Washington Post story, to get to how this ended, came out on June 2nd. 1999. Let me read you an excerpt from June 5th, 1999, from the Los Angeles Times. This is from a Mary Beth Sheridan story called Reno Backs Mexican Counterpart.
This is 3 days after?
3 days later. So I won't read the whole story, but just this excerpt. U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno declared Friday that she has, quote, every confidence in Mexico's top prosecutor as she and other U.S. officials sought to quell a controversy over alleged drug corruption that casts a shadow over a high-level meeting here. Mexican officials reacted angrily to the reports on Carlos Hank Gonzalez and the criminal cartels, and said Friday that they had asked the State Department to either deny or provide information about them. So they want the information and the sources that the U.S. has. Here's what Attorney General Janet Reno said. She went on record and she said, quote, it is unfair and just plain wrong to make judgments on the basis of fragmented reports. I have every confidence in the Attorney General of Mexico, Jorge Madrazo. And then the story goes on to say that U.S. and Mexican officials blamed a hostile press and, listen to this, unidentified conservative forces in the United States for the newspaper reports. However, the controversy seemed to point up differences within the U.S. government on how to address the Mexican drug threat. It could have been written today. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And what's interesting is the Mexican reaction, which is to say, this is just hostile press. It's
propaganda.
It's just propaganda. It's conservatives, who are using the media, which is a little bit odd when you stop and think about it, to launch attacks against Mexican officials. And this demand that the Americans turn over their sources, which of course will mean the sources are killed probably. But then you also have the phenomenon which is happening right now with the Biden regime. It happened with the Clintons as well. That American officialdom, practically tripped over itself to exonerate the guy that their own personnel had to write. This quote from Janet Reno, it's 25 years ago, but it could be today. She is throwing her own people at DOJ under the bus. The men and the women who labored and worked to nail the Gonzalez family, Carlos Hank and the Hank sons, dead to rights, and she throws them under the bus. I'll add this, Carlos Hank Gonzalez, who actually at this point didn't have long to live. I don't recall exactly how he passed away, but he had some kind of a cancer that killed him, if I'm remembering accurately. He hired former Senator Warren Rudman, a Republican, to represent him on Capitol Hill. And former Senator Rudman, successfully lobbied the Clinton administration to basically not only declare Carlos Hank Gonzalez exonerated, but also effectively to ruin the careers and work of the men and women at the United States Department of Justice who conducted the investigation against him. And it really is this example. This is why I read the piece, not only because the reactions and the narrative is very familiar to those of us who've seen now under AMLO, the Cienfuegos case, the ProPublica reports, the whole Narco Presidente affair, but also this incredibly distressing and perennial phenomenon of Mexican criminal elites and U.S. elites in Washington, D.C. coming together to protect one another and provide cover for one another. And that's one of the things that we here at the foundation and certainly on this podcast and the show work hard against. That phenomenon. We can't change Mexican behavior, obviously, as Americans, but we can sure as heck change American behavior, and that's one thing that we want to do.
Yeah, well, great passage. It definitely could have been written today. And I'm also glad you chose it because it's a perfect segue into the first thing that I wanted to talk about today. And it is some pretty breaking news that has just started, unfolding in the past week. So let's go ahead and jump right in. On Friday evening, I'll give the whole background just because I don't think a lot of people know what's happening.
This is such a weird story. You should give the
It's such
full
a weird
background.
story,
Yeah,
so
go
I will
ahead.
do that. So on Friday evening, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador announced the severing of diplomatic relations with Ecuador. And this was in response to Ecuadorian police breaking through the doors of the Mexican consulate in Quito, Ecuador's capital, to arrest former Ecuadorian Vice President Jorge Glass, who had been living there since December, where he sought political asylum after he was indicted on corruption and bribery charges. So the charges, I believe, he's being investigated over irregularities during his management of reconstruction efforts after the powerful earthquake in 2016.
Right.
But he has also previously been convicted of other corruption and bribery charges, specifically because he's had some corrupt oil deals with China as vice president. And he's actually served time in prison. He actually was on house arrest before he went into the Mexican embassy.
I see.
So there's a lot of background here, right? Also, fun fact, he was Rafael Correa's right-hand man. Apparently, he was his very loyal follower.
We should explain who Rafael Correa is for the listeners.
Do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, please. Yeah, sorry.
Well, he's how do I say it? Leftist dictator.
Yeah,
former president of Ecuador.
Yeah. Oops.
And
there goes my pen.
So, there's a lot of background. But anyway, now he is in a maximum security prison, Jorge Glass is. And I want to start by unpacking, what happened, how it happened, what might happen. So how did this happen? Ecuador's foreign minister, Gabriela Sommerfeld, has told reporters that the decision was made by the president, who we have talked about on this show before,
Noboa.
Daniel Noboa, because they felt that they had exhausted all possibilities of negotiating or diplomatically trying to talk to Mexico, A, and because they considered Jorge Glass to be like an imminent flight risk.
That's right.
So they decided to, go ahead and storm the embassy. And the foreign minister said that it's also, they don't think that it's legal to grant asylum or refuge to criminals that have been convicted of crimes by competent courts, is the language.
Yeah.
And so therefore Mexico would be violating Article 3 of the Caracas Convention.
Right.
In response to Ecuador's accusation, Mexico also made accusations, and their foreign minister, Alicia Bárcena, who we've talked about, on this podcast lot, then said that Ecuador is violating the Vienna Convention, which provides like the diplomatic norms and treaties. And as we know, like embassies are considered foreign soil, etc.
Right.
And she said that Mexico is going to take this case to the International Court of Justice in the Netherlands because Ecuador is violating international law.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to discuss here, but I want to talk about what this all means. Like, obviously, there's like a historical and, I guess, fundamental right to seeking asylum.
Yeah.
And like I said, embassies are considered foreign soil. And so, the host country's police force can't just barge in without the permission of the ambassador. So we've seen this happen in many different countries. We've seen people seek asylum. We've seen people live from days to years in foreign embassies, like we've seen with Julian Assange.
Who was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
Funny enough, in London.
Yeah.
How long has 7 years, and
Quite a
British
while.
police can't go in and arrest him.
Yeah.
So it's funny, it's kind of come full circle. But that being said, there's a lot of opinions on this, right? Like, two wrongs don't make a right. A lot of people are wrong here. The Ecuadorian president is wrong because he did violate some diplomatic norms, and this is not a good time to be doing that, right? With the democratic backslide going on in South America. But that being said, like, the Mexican embassy is also wrong because they intervened and provided refuge to a twice convicted criminal.
Right.
So, the Mexican government and their meddling is becoming a real threat to the region, and people are starting to take notice. So I wanted to ask you your initial thoughts before we jump into some other stuff.
Wow. I mean, we could do a whole show on this.
Oh, yeah.
I am now. We should be clear. I mean, the Ecuadorians have just gotten slammed. They lost a vote at the OAS today, the Organization of American States. The U.S. State Department has spoken against them. Of course, AMLO and the Cuatro T have lost their minds over the topic because it's an insult to Mexican sovereignty and so on. So one thing that's permanent in Mexican governance is the only people allowed to insult Mexican sovereignty are criminal cartels. They're allowed to do it. They get carte blanche. Nobody else can.
They're okay.
Because they're hand in glove with the government. To kind of pull the camera back, I want to mount a defense of the Ecuadorians, and it is probably true, overwhelmingly probable that they did violate the Vienna Convention, right, on the inviolability of diplomatic facilities and things like that. And,
right.
And they certainly went the extra mile. I don't know if you saw the footage, but they actually took the Mexican ambassador and essentially threw him to the ground. Outside after sort of to make a point. I mean, it was almost Chicago rules the way they did it. Although I think a lot of that was intentional. Like it was designed to send a message. But that being said, the Mexicans, AMLO and the Morenistas and the Cuatro T regime have been storing this up for a very, very long time. And it is, I think, the biggest surprise to me is that something like this has not happened before. Ecuador has gone through essentially 3 years of Mexico-style hyper-violence related to drug cartels. And one of the major drivers of it is the Sinaloa cartel, which is a Mexican-based cartel. It's the same cartel that reportedly, if you believe ProPublica and the New York Times, which I do, has had AMLO and his sons in their campaign on their payroll for years and years as well, and so obliquely in some fashion. And so the branch of Sinaloa cartel enforcers, sicarios, personnel in Ecuador is a group called the Choneros, right? And so the Choneros have been extremely active. They killed a major Ecuadorian presidential candidate last August, right? I mean, it was in the summer.
Francisco Villavicencio.
Yeah, Villavicencio. Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you. And so they killed him because he was going to be tough on crime. So they just shot him. What's interesting is that they killed him. It was pretty well understood that it was the Choneros Choneros that did it, and it was very revelatory. You look at this, whether it's in Mexico, outside of Mexico, anytime the Sinaloa cartel comes under attack from any corner, it is almost inevitable that the president of Mexico, Andres Manuel López Obrador, is going to have something nice to say about the Sinaloans at the Mañanera the next day. And that's exactly what he did after the Choneros killed this major Ecuadorian presidential candidate who was probably going to win the election, if you believe the polls. But he went to the Mañanera and he basically made fun of it. He made fun of it. He made fun of it. And then when the elections were held and Noboa wins in Ecuador, and he's sort of the let's say the backup candidate, is probably not fair. But AMLO, completely unforced, decided to mock that too, and basically question the integrity of Ecuadorian elections, which is pretty rich for him to do, given the literally hundreds and sometimes thousands of Mexican candidates who are killed by cartels every electoral cycle. So he does this and stores up a lot of ill will for that. I mean, imagine after, say, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, that there was a country that had sponsored the killing. For example, I guess it depends on which conspiracy theory you listen to. But let's say there had been a country that had sponsored the killings, and there was no governmental groups, and the president of that country just mocked the United States for the fact that, oh, you lost your president, and so on. It's kind of what AMLO did to the Ecuadorians. And then to add insult to injury, this guy Jorge Glass, who himself had connections to the Choneros, slips house arrest, shows up at the Mexican embassy, and is immediately granted asylum. Not just in the embassy, but actually is offered asylum in Mexico. In fact, AMLO tries to send
the day before, right?
Yes, a Mexican Air Force aircraft to Quito to pick him up. It's very
Evo.
serious. Like Evo, yeah. I'm going to get to that too, because I think this is all part of it. And so they do this. And, I think what you see is the Ecuadorian power structure, starting with President Noboa, just saying, we've had enough. We've had enough. It has been Mexican criminal gangs, which are affiliated with the Mexican state, who have been, putting Ecuadorian society through hell over the past 3 years. And we know you're linked. We know that's why you're giving Glass asylum in the embassy. It's not out of a humanitarian impulse. It is because it is state policy in Mexico to lend a hand to the Sinaloa cartel. Which I will stand by. I think that's absolutely true. We've seen it again and again and again and again, whether it's versus the Americans or anything else. Do you remember when the Americans had intelligence reports on the Sinaloa cartel?
Yes.
Yeah, and AMLO was just outraged at the fact that they would spy on criminal cartels and demanded that they turn over the information things. This is the same phenomenon. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, he was just saying that it was bad information and that it was spying, essentially.
Spying is not something the Americans should be doing, right? And so it's because it's impossible not to notice. And you and I have both spoken with journalists in Mexico who've noticed the pattern. Of course, he has nothing bad to say about the Sinaloans ever. This is part of it. So the Ecuadorians, they finally do what they wish to do, which is they kick in the embassy door, they swarm it with armed police, soldiers actually, I think. And they throw the Mexican ambassador on the ground, and they get Glass. Glass is now in a coma, by the way. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't know that.
Apparently, it's a little bit gauzy because like people in custody, like falling on a bunch of bullets, will suddenly have something happen to him.
Well, apparently he was like kicked in the head and all of these
things. Well, that's one theory. The other theory is that he tried to commit suicide with pills. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But anyway, the point is he's in a coma. Here's so. If you want to delve further into conspiracy land, I don't know if you saw, because I don't think you and I talked about it. Did you see what the New York Times reporter for New York Times in Espanol was tweeting about this?
No, I haven't.
So I'm blanking on her name. I should have written it down, but I made a note to mention it. Now, the New York Times, if we talk to any of the Cuatro T people, they say the New York Times has an axe out to grind with AMLO. Because
I wonder why.
We have to go through this too. So, it just gets more and more complicated. The New York Times is one of the two publications in the past 3 months that has published stories on the Mexican president's links to drug cartels, which go back to at least 2006, if not before. And as a consequence, the president of Mexico, AMLO, tried to basically dox Natalie Katroff, who's the New York Times bureau chief in Mexico City. And so now the New York Times has it in for AMLO. I mean, they just do. Institutional revenge, they're susceptible to it, but they have pretty good reason for it, because he basically tried to do a Henry II, versus Thomas à Becket thing. Well, no one rid me of this turbulent foreign journalist from the New York Times, and is not improbable, because it's happened to others, that getting mentioned at the Mañanera gets you killed by some random follower.
Mexico's the most dangerous country in the world for journalists right now.
It's worse than Syria and Iraq. Yeah, absolutely. And so to that point, what was interesting to me is that this woman from the New York Times, who I have to apologize to listeners, I did not write her name down, but she was tweeting out that Glass was being interviewed in custody, not just by Ecuadorian officials, but by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as well, and that the Americans who condemned the embassy seizure, nevertheless, at least for some elements of the U.S. law enforcement apparatus, is taking the opportunity to talk to this guy, at least while he was conscious and speaking, and that too is very interesting. So I mean, I think what you see here is you see a Mexico that is, despite its rhetoric, one of the most interventionist countries in the hemisphere. You mentioned Evo Morales, right? And so do you want to remind the viewers what the Mexicans did with him when he was kicked out of the country by kind of this people's revolution?
Yeah, so he had nowhere to go, right?
Yeah.
So he
Bolivian president.
Yeah, Bolivian dictator.
Dictator.
By the way,
yes.
He stayed much longer than he should have stayed, changed the constitution, completely changed the Supreme Court so that he could stay on longer. He tried to pull this referendum so that the people would give him the ability to run for a fourth time. Back in the day, Bolivian presidents could only serve one term. Then they changed that to 2. He served 3, and he wanted to serve a 4th. And so the referendum said no. Everyone voted, no, we don't want you to run again. And he was like, it's my human right. And people are racist because I'm indigenous. I'm the first indigenous president of this country. And so he decided to run anyway. And there was a lot of irregularities with the election, and people were really mad. They took to the streets. They protested to the point where even the police sided with the people because there was a lot of stuff that was wrong. And so he had to flee. And of course, Mexico to the rescue. They came to pick him up like a celebrity. Yeah. So, Mexico, we've talked about this a little bit before, but Mexico kind of has a reputation for doing that.
They sent the Air Force.
Yeah.
They sent the Air Force to La Paz to get
Maybe
him.
I'll link the picture.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible, and there's that photo, which is probably one you're thinking of, where he's getting off the aircraft in Mexico City, and they're there to greet him. What's interesting is when that happened in 2019, is that right?
Yes.
So that happened in 2019, and the press coverage at the time, I was reading a story. I didn't print it out for the show, but I was reading a story. It was actually in the Washington Post that was trying to explain. It was contemporaneous. This is 5 years ago. And what it says is that Mexico was just following the same tradition of refuge and solicitude refugees that marked its intake of Spanish Republicans during the 1930s, right? That it was just sort of this humanitarian impulse. And at the time, obviously it probably looked different to you all in Bolivia, but at the time you could sort of like narrow your eyes and be like, okay, you know what? I can see that. Like, it's misguided, but whatever, it's this thing. But what's become obvious in the half decade since is that that's not true at all. The Mexican state does. If the Mexican state cared about refugees, and there's several million trafficked people coming through Mexico, every week, that they could take care of, which they simply choose not to. What the Mexican state cares about is other leftists, other autocrats, and other individuals who are involved in Mexican drug cartel operations, and that's who gets Mexican support. So to kind of bring it back full circle, I empathize strongly. I don't endorse storming embassies, but I empathize strongly with the Ecuadorians who you could argue struck back against a state threat in being that had menaced them for too long. And I think what's great about this is I have to admire President Noboa, who I otherwise know just in candor very little about, but I admire the fact that he has completely not buckled to any of the pressure put on him. And this has been no apologies. There's been no amelioration of it. And what's been interesting is that the Mexican state has been revealed as essentially impotent in this, like they have no hard power. I'll share this too. One of the things that your Mexican friends and mine I've talked about was this kind of conspiracy theory. I don't think it'll come to pass, but maybe it does. That AMLO would declare a state of war, not really to attack Ecuador, but just say there's a state of war between us because Ecuador has attacked Mexican territory, and then that'll be used as a pretext for a variety of suppression of civil society or something like that. I mean, who knows? I doubt it will happen. But what was interesting, that spurred me to go look up what Mexican and Ecuadorian hard power actually was, and it was very revelatory. I didn't expect a lot, but I was surprised to learn that Ecuador, tiny Ecuador, probably outclasses Mexico from a naval standpoint, and probably is at parity with Mexico from an Air Force standpoint. And now we're talking like 5 or 6 aircraft maybe, and there was one point a decade back, this is in the Peña Nieto era, in which Mexico had no fighter aircraft at all. You know what that illustrates, to kind of expand the aperture into grand strategy. The reason that you do have these Latin American militaries that are, Mexico has a large army. It's relatively proficient at what it does, which is frequently trafficking. But they've got a large army, but they have no power projection. And they have no power projection, none of them, because Latin American armies are predominantly, with minor exceptions, they're not for use against other countries. They're for use against their own citizenry. They're power insurance. But the other part of it is that because they're power insurance, they don't worry about external actors coming in and threatening the sovereignty because they believe that the United States will defend the hemisphere. That's why. That's why Mexico and Ecuador can't actually really go to war with one another, because there's never been, for the whole region, historically, for the past 200 years, there really hasn't been a reason to fear that kind of intervention. I just overstated my case a little bit because I can think of several interventions, but I think the major point stands, which is that when you kind of pull that curtain away, you're forced to look at it. It's something other than what you would expect from normal state-on-state power capacities. Anyway. I've talked too much.
No. Well, and I'll keep talking about this just a little while longer just because there's so much to unpack here. But you said the president hasn't buckled to all of the pressure. I guess we will see what that continues to look like. I know that there's been a lot of aftermath. Some of the aftermath was like Ecuador declared the Mexican ambassador to be like a persona non grata.
Yeah.
And now there's been a little bit of talk. I know like we've talked about this and we've kind of had a little bit of questions about this. Some possible aftermath to think about is the Ecuadorian interior minister is a dual Mexican citizen. Born and raised in Durango, I believe. Didn't move, kind of like me. She didn't move to Ecuador until she was, I think, 20 or 21. So she's Mexican. And she was only nationalized as an Ecuadorian last year when she was appointed as a minister. And so, and so now there's been a little bit of talk about, like, do you think that AMLO would be willing to take away that Mexican citizenship just to make a point or just to put a little bit more pressure on the Ecuadorians? Like, it's all speculation, I think, at this point. But
do you know what brought her to Ecuador and what brought her into Ecuadorian politics? Did you look into that?
I need to look into it.
I don't know either. Yeah,
I wonder what it was.
But it is a complicating factor, isn't it? Yeah.
I wonder, we'll keep listeners updated, but I wonder what will happen. That's definitely an interesting piece to it.
It is. It is.
But I think we've dwelled on that long enough. We'll have to continue to update and see what happens. But I really want to get to AMLO's 60-minute interview. I think we can't not have an episode of Hard Country and talk about that, right? Because it was just fascinating. I think a lot of people don't stay up to date with, AMLO and what's happening with the Mexican government. But the fact that he appeared on 60 Minutes was huge because people that, don't usually know what's happening with the Mexican government listened to that episode and they were like, that sounds like a lie.
Yeah.
Like your average person that doesn't even work in policy, like your average American heard that and they were like, what's happening here? And I got some questions on it.
Go ahead. Yeah, you want to tell us, you put together a great tweet thread for the Texas Public Policy Foundation about the top lies of AMLO's 60 Minutes interview. You want to
And I have them all, most of the lies.
Go ahead.
There was a lot, but I have most of the lies right here, and I thought it would be fun if we went through them and disproved a couple of them.
Let's do it.
Just in case there's people out there that actually believe that. So a couple of things that he said. AMLO said that they are and that they will continue to help the U.S. slow down migration. And there's so many quotes that we had for this, and we've talked about a couple of them right here on the show, but Mexico has multiple times encouraged the passage of migrants through Mexico on their way to the U.S.
Yeah.
Let's remember when Chihuahua Governor Maru Campos begged for help from the federal government to deal with the humanitarian crisis at the border. She was told that Mexico is a country of asylum with open doors for migrants, and that the federal government would continue to ensure their free passage through Mexico instead of helping themselves, right? There's also been lots of comments about Mexico not being the U.S.'s migration police, and that Mexico's decisions would be made to continue to improve the quality of migration for their foreign brothers. So he's saying that they will continue to help the U.S. That's not what they've said in the past, right?
Well, they can't afford to give up the human trafficking revenues.
Exactly.
I mean, that's just the reality. Yeah.
That is a reality.
Yeah.
Another thing that he said was, of course we prosecute homicides, when he was asked about crime and homicides in Mexico and all of the violence. And he said, there's no impunity in Mexico. They all get prosecuted. Josh, about 5% of the country's homicides are actually prosecuted. And I think that's a more generous estimate. I've seen other studies cite that 98% of violent crimes, including homicides, go unsolved.
Yeah, the clearance rate for murder in Mexico is in the low single digits. It's a great place if you want to murder somebody.
And get away with it.
Yeah, it is. And
the homicide rate remains near historical highs.
Oh, yeah.
But it's most likely underestimated because there are massive amounts of missing people right now. And unfortunately, a lot of them are never found and are likely victims of homicide. Huge numbers of missing people.
And the state, exactly to your point, Melissa, the state has monkeyed with those statistics as well because they just did the reclassification of those who are missing, and so they're taken off the presumed dead rolls.
Because they're missing
because they've been missing for like 20 years, right? But everybody knows that these people are killed.
Everybody.
There was a find last week of, I think it was 170 people in the mass grave. Where was it? In Guerrero, maybe it was. But, that kind of thing happens all the time in Mexico. Do you remember when they did the search for the Ayotzinapa victims?
The missing students.
The missing students.
Yeah.
What was amazing to me, and kind of the anecdote that I share, is that they formed there was a group of citizens and parents who formed essentially a citizen task force to go look for the bodies. They assumed that their 43 kids were dead. It's tragic. So they looked for it. And what was interesting, they never found their 43 kids. But they found mass grave after mass grave after mass grave all over the region, around Ayotzinapa, on the roads leading to it. And what emerged is that murder at scale happens all the time.
All the time.
Never prosecuted.
Never.
Yeah.
But of course they prosecute homicides. They all get prosecuted. That's the quote.
Yeah. Well,
that's what he said.
Presidente says so. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So another thing that he said, actually this goes hand in hand with the last thing we just talked about. He said he does not negotiate with criminals. He said, what you have to do with the criminals is apply the law. I'm not going to establish contact or communication with a criminal. Well, I think we would like to remind everyone that in the past, AMLO has welcomed proposals to work with drug cartels.
Absolutely.
Including recently when he said that he would support a proposal to work with drug traffickers so that people that are searching for their missing loved ones could be able to find them. So he is willing to negotiate with criminals.
Absolutely. I mean these pactos de paz, right? That he loves talking about.
Yeah.
It's those. It's his infamous visit to El Chapo's mother that he's talked about. Again, with the ProPublica and New York Times story, his campaign and people adjacent to him and his sons are known to have liaised with cartel men.
We could fill up a whole episode with examples. Actually, we have a big document talking about examples. He's also, when he was asked about cartel violence, he called it propaganda once. Yeah. He talked about organized crime behaving better than white collar criminals. There's a lot of quotes like this.
Because organized crime doesn't oppose him.
Right.
That really is the metric.
Yeah.
I mean, as reductionist as it is to say, that's 100% the case.
So that's one more thing that he lied about. And there's a ton. Here's a funny one. He claimed that he has basically succeeded in completely getting rid of corruption. I don't know if you want to take that one. I feel like we can skip right over it.
Well,
But
let me add something to it, though, because, I mean, that's obviously preposterous. I mean, getting rid of Mexican corruption would be a world historical event that we would be celebrating on the show had it actually happened. There was a quote that he made within the past couple months, and I was talking to one of our Mexico City colleagues about it because it was just jaw-dropping to me. He said that corruption is not indigenous to Mexico, that before the arrival of the Spanish, there was not corruption in Mexico. I guess he sincerely believes this idea that the Aztec society, basically, or whatever Aztec, Mayan, Tlaxcalan, whatever, didn't have corruption, and corruption only exists because Spanish and European influence wrecked Mexican, I don't know what you call it, indigenismo, or sort of this purity of nature that flourished before the Christians showed up. The nutty thing about it is that I think he might believe it. Like, I think he might actually think it's true. Yeah, yeah.
The things that the mind can do, you can talk yourself into actually believing this. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So he also said, actually, we kind of addressed this on the last episode with Humberto, but he said that he can travel throughout the entire country without a problem, and that there's not a single region that he can't go and visit. I know, obviously, we've talked about the percentages of Mexico that are directly controlled by cartels. It's estimated to be about 35 to 40%.
Right.
And we talked about this when Claudia Scheinbaum took her little road trip. But just the fact that this says a lot, right? Your ordinary Mexican cannot say the same. And this reminds me, when I was in San Miguel a couple of weeks ago, before I was going to come meet you in Mexico City, I was trying to figure out the best way to get from San Miguel to Mexico City. And I was like, it's actually really close. Like, I could take a bus. I could do this. I could do that. Because you have to drive up to the nearest airport. It's like 2 hours. I was like, I might as well. Yeah.
Is that what you had to do?
I did. I had to drive 2 hours, to the airport just to take a flight. It could have been much quicker if I just went straight to Mexico City on a bus.
But it was not safe to do so?
But I told some people, like some of my Mexican friends, because I was there for a wedding, and they were like, no way. We would never do that. Nobody would ever do that. Like, it's extremely unsafe.
Really?
Don't do that. And it just so happens that another reason why they didn't recommend doing that is because there was strikes. There was like transportation strikes that entire week. And it was strikes from truck drivers who rightfully so were protesting to not get killed while they were on the job. And it's because at least 50 truck drivers were killed on the country's roads this year. A lot of truck drivers. And there has been like this wave of truck drivers being killed because they're driving on the wrong road. And, even AMLO himself has recognized that he doesn't have full sovereignty over his territory, because he boasted about how narcos respect his teams at checkpoints.
Right.
Because they have all these illegal checkpoints.
His social welfare teams.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But,
Well, I'm sure it's true, though. I'm sure it's true. I mean, just as Claudia went on the Reynosa Nuevo Laredo highway, it probably is true that there's no place in the country he can't go.
I was going to say, that's not a lie.
That's because he enjoys the protection of the cartels with whom he works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not a lie, but it says a lot,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Another claim, Mexico doesn't produce fentanyl. I don't even feel like I need to address this one, because we know cartels are mass producing fentanyl.
Yes, they are.
There's little debate about it.
Yeah.
But actually, like, if AMLO is going to continue playing dumb, maybe we should remind him that his own army announced last year it seized more than 500,000 fentanyl pills in Culiacan. It's not the first time that has happened, even in that location.
Well, his argument would be that it was just transiting through Culiacan.
I'm sure he would find an argument.
Yeah.
And then one of the last things that I want to talk about is, again, he claims there's no drug consumption in Mexico, and that's a U.S. problem because of all of our social decay and our youth not getting enough hugs. And we have talked about this, but I read this story that I thought was so sad and also so powerful, because there's the reason that fentanyl consumption appears relatively low in Mexico is because they aren't trying to detect it. There's no government data for it. And I was reading that apparently forensic authorities don't even have the equipment to detect it when they're doing autopsies or when they get a corpse. But this new research that I was reading shows that Mexicans are increasingly consuming drugs, that fentanyl use is spreading into Mexico. And a new testing initiative showed that 23% of 1,100 bodies that were sent to the morgue in the last year tested positive for fentanyl.
23%.
That's huge.
I hadn't seen that.
Yes, and you know, people are feeling the effects. One of the quotes that I read that I thought was really sad is from a paramedic. His name is Julio Buenrostro, and he said, this is a quote, "The president says there isn't any fentanyl here, but every day we're seeing people dying from it."
Yeah.
So, you know, AMLO keeps claiming that it's a U.S. problem. That's not true either.
60 Minutes interview is interesting because, you know, he really, he's always been incurious about other parts of the world. You know, he doesn't really have any interest in the United States, and he doesn't have any interest in traveling. But he did this, and he goes on 60 Minutes, apparently with the belief that the American audience is the same as the Mexican one, wants to hear the same things and will fall for the same things. And it's just the negative backlash to it.
Yeah.
I think, you know, hopefully educated him to the extent that he's educable. That's just not the case.
It's just not the case.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the last thing that I wanted to talk about segues into the next topic that I
Okay.
want to talk about, so it's perfect. But AMLO said there were very few instances of violence surrounding the elections, and that instances like those, the very few that there are not a threat to democracy. So I wanted to talk to you about this because the number of government officials and, you know, candidates in Mexico that are being murdered has risen dramatically since the last elections in 2018,
Yeah.
which was already high. According to a research organization called Civic Data, there was a 236% increase in political electoral violence in the country between the last elections in 2018 and now, 2023.
Yeah, I believe it.
And I think I'm seeing more cases than ever in the last couple of weeks. So, you know, this is not updated yet. But there's so much insecurity around these elections, and there's some really horrific stories. A couple of weeks ago, this one was big because the two Mexican mayoral candidates were killed hours apart in the same town. And then late last week, I think this was 6 days ago, in broad daylight, during a campaign event where she was surrounded by all her supporters, a candidate for mayor of Celaya, Guanajuato, was shot and killed a day after she started her campaign.
Jeez.
So this isn't new. Like, as we know, drug cartels have been doing this for a while to, I guess, extort money from municipal governments or threaten the police. But there are two interesting things, the reason I bring this up, that I think sum up a lot of trends that we've been seeing. One, state prosecutors came out and said they were investigating this killing of this mayor. But of course, no arrests have been made.
Right.
There's been no updates on progress. And second, and this is really weird, it was reported when this happened that a city council candidate was also fatally shot in the incident. But the security ministry later came out and they said that that person wasn't killed, but that they were just missing. And I thought that was
really?
interesting because we've
Wow.
talked about how so many homicides are covered up with missing people and how like those
And vice versa.
statistics are messed with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course, like as would be expected, I feel like AMLO continues to deny that it's happening. And part of the reason is because as we remember, the Sinaloa cartel mobilized in favor of his party in his elections before. In 2021, in Sinaloa,
Yeah.
they kidnapped opposition operatives until after the votes were cast.
That's right. We've written on that.
And people don't know this. A lot of people don't know this.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, about that. And I wanted to ask you about an interesting stat saying that the states governed by Morena account for 86% of the murders of candidates and pre-candidates for elected office during the current electoral process.
I wondered about that, whether there's a direct linkage to be made between Morena power holders and the killing of candidates. I mean, it would go to follow, but I don't actually know that that's true. So that's something that somebody out there in the internet should look up and post a comment on. the killing of candidates writ large, and there have been Morena candidates killed as well. I mean, we should acknowledge, is really illustrative of and symptomatic of the broader breakdown in Mexican civil society that has absolutely accelerated under López Obrador. And in the long run, unarrested, which currently it means the end of what's left of Mexican democracy, which gets us to a very, very dark place. But look, it's not going to change until there's other actors in the system that demand a change, or until the people of Mexico themselves writ large demand a change. And I don't see either on the horizon right now, which is extremely unfortunate.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. Well, we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to touch on a couple of more things, and I'll try to do it quickly.
Okay, we'll do it quickly.
Right now, since we're on the topic of Morena, I wanted to share something that I thought was kind of funny, and that is, I think I sent you an article on it yesterday, but AMLO's reaction to the very first presidential debate, which happened on Sunday. And I thought it was funny because AMLO said that he was offended by Morena nominee Claudia Sheinbaum's performance because he didn't feel like she recognized anything that his administration had accomplished. So I think there's a lot of reasons to criticize that presidential debate, like it was kind of a mess.
Yeah.
But I just found that it was quite funny that the only reason that AMLO wasn't happy about it was because it wasn't about him.
Yeah, I read about that. He does have a tendency to center everything on himself, and so I didn't. In full candor, transparency with the audience, I did not watch the Mexican presidential debate because I think I had an appointment to like wash my hair or something like that. I don't know. It was something different. But yeah, you were the one who actually told me that he was offended by it and saddened by it. And what's interesting is that he feels so secure in his control of the party and so sure of the election outcome that he can insult and undermine Claudia Sheinbaum, who's had a real problem trying to get out from under AMLO's shadow, right? And to hit out at her is, you have to interpret it as a conscious humiliation of him, almost a machismo move, reminding her who's really the patron, who's really the boss, and to whom she owes allegiance and fealty. It's not the people of Mexico, it's to him. And I would guarantee that once she is president, because it's overwhelmingly probable that she'll win, that he is going to undermine her again and again and again. He is not going to fade away into the background once he's out of office.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Well, you heard it here first.
Well, we'll see. But thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, and thank you for everybody that's listening. We will see you next time.